to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're talking about the urgent need for the nonprofit sector to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in its operations, leadership, and workplace. Joining us today is Dr. Wendy Cukier, the founder of the Diversity Institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University and academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and research lead of the Future Skills Center. Welcome to the podcast, Wendy.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
Well, over the past 30 months, we've certainly seen a big uptick in awareness and enthusiasm expressed in the nonprofit sector to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion generally within their organizations. But I'm curious what you've observed in the work that you do day to day with nonprofit leaders and professionals. Are they really actually, getting to work, rolling up their sleeves and doing what they need to make DEI in their organizations a reality?
Well, it's an interesting question because certainly there's a lot more talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion today than there was 3 years ago. There's a lot more focus on truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples than there was 3 years ago. And certainly people are prepared now to name things like anti-Black racism and recognize that they are real problems. So in that regard, we've made a lot of progress in my view. However, when we dig into the numbers, when we look at the actions, I think there's still quite a long way to go. And we know in the sector, for example, women for a long time have held most of the roles in the nonprofit and charitable sector, but they tend still to be underrepresented in leadership relative to their representation in the workforce. We know that racialized people and newcomers, and especially Black people, are still very underrepresented, especially in leadership roles. And persons with disabilities and those who identify as Indigenous or LGBTQ2S+ are still almost invisible. So when it comes to actual representation at the top of the house, I think we still see some gaps. When it comes to actual policies and programs and accountability frameworks, one of the Stats Canada results of their survey was that only about 30% of charitable and nonprofit organizations they spoke to had a written policy on EDI, for example, for the board of directors. So I think it's a question of, glass half full, glass half empty. We've come a long way, but there's certainly lots more to do.
Well, it certainly can feel for many organizations, especially smaller ones, like a really big thing to tackle, particularly those with limited staff and resources. We know that from the respondents in our Charity Village Diversity Survey, which reported that although they wanted to do a better job of integrating EDI into their organizations, they really struggled with knowing what to do and what to tackle first and where to start. What advice would you have for nonprofits really beginning their EDI journey?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and it certainly can look like a massive undertaking, but it's like any other strategy an organization has to develop. Most nonprofits have a fundraising strategy. Most nonprofits have an HR strategy. Most nonprofits have a strategic plan. So the place to start is at the beginning. And the first thing you want to know is, where are you? What do you have? What do you not have in terms of policies and practices? Are you collecting data on representation at different levels within the organization? Do you have employee engagement surveys where you're looking at different experiences working in the organization? Are you applying an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to all of the work that you do, the design of your programs, marketing and outreach, your philanthropy and government relations strategy? So it really is, it's like any strategy. You have to break it down into pieces. You have to know where you are in order to be able to set goals, and you need to be able to count, because obviously at the end of the day, representation is not the only thing, but it's certainly an important part of a strategy.
Yes, unless you know where you're starting, you can't really measure anything, which is certainly critical to the success of these programs. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of research and reports. The Harvard Business Review, for example, has reported that the majority of diversity programs actually fail. Why do you think that is? And what can nonprofits do to avoid that and to ensure they actually succeed?
Well, we're currently in the process of digging in on this a little bit more, but I can I can talk about another example, which was a massive failure, and that was the effort to get more women into science, technology, engineering, and math. It's something we've worked on for more than 30 years since the Montreal Massacre, and there are fewer women in computer science today, and only marginally more in engineering than there were 30 years ago. And all of the talk and all of the engineering camps and the astronauts going to schools and so on did not produce the change that we were looking for. Why would that be? My view is that, there are no simple solutions to complex problems. So in order to drive systems change, and that's really what we're talking about, or in order to drive organizational change, you need to really understand how the system works. Where are the barriers? What are the levers that you can use to move things forward? And unfortunately, my observation is a lot of diversity and inclusion plans start with things like, training programs or employee resource groups, which are great, but they are not going to. They're sort of necessary, but insufficient. They're not in and of themselves going to drive change. In order to drive change, you need targets, you need commitments, you need a strategy, you need leadership, and you need an accountability framework. I argue all the time. I've chaired the board at Women's College Hospital. We had every board meeting, we had a scorecard, we had benchmarks, we looked at risk factors. In the same way that you look at your fundraising targets, you should be looking at where you are with your EDI strategy. In the same way that, large nonprofits, especially those that rely on philanthropy, have very nuanced and sophisticated planning where they identify prospects and where they are with the prospects and how much money's coming in and how much money is promised. They know how to do those plans. It's exactly the same thing with EDI. Think if a nonprofit simply said, we want to raise money and left it at that, or ran workshops on how to raise money and left it at that, you would not see the same progress in terms of getting money in the door that you see when targets are set and when there's an intentional strategy. Same thing with equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the more it is embedded in your overall corporate strategy, the more it's baked in to how you see your organization, the services that you're providing, where you're accessing partnerships, where you're getting funds from, and so on. The more you apply a gender and diversity lens at all of those stages, the more effective your strategy is going to be. But we're way beyond, rainbow posters and consciousness raising workshops. We really need accountability.
Well, let's talk about the 50/30 challenge because that's really designed to create sort of measurements that would create accountability. Can you tell me about really what it's about and the program and how it's being embraced in Canada and how it could apply to the nonprofit sector?
Thanks so much for that question, because it's really, for me, it's one of the most exciting initiatives I've seen in many, many years. So the 50/30 Challenge is an initiative that it aims at improving representation on boards and in senior leadership roles in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, in post-secondary institutions, hospitals, and agencies, boards, and commissions. Since and it's a voluntary code, since it was launched, I guess coming up to 2 years ago, 1,750 organizations have signed up to the challenge. And what's interesting about the challenge is, you don't have to meet the standard in order to be part of the challenge. You need to aspire to increase gender parity and diversity. So the 50% refers to women and or non-binary people on boards and or senior management. And the 30% refers to other forms of diversity, which would include racialized people, including Black people, persons living with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, those who identify as 2S LGBTQ+. And so what I like about it is it gives you a lot more flexibility than, for example, hard quotas would. Because think about it, if you're in Toronto, more than half the population is racialized. So setting a target of 30% racialized people on your board is almost a minimum standard in this community. But if you're in St. John's, Newfoundland, where only 7% of the population is racialized, that's not going to make a lot of sense. So the 30% can be comprised of a variety of diverse people. And the other thing that's nice is that you can count intersectionality. So for example, if you had a board of 10 people, half of them were women, 3 of the women were racialized, you would hit 50-30. So we're really excited, just given the momentum that we're seeing around this, and it's clear and it's simple. Apart from the representation piece, however, the 50-30 challenge recognizes that you can't change the top of the house if you don't have policies for getting people in the door. So it addresses with, series of indicators and support for best practices, everything from, how do you make a more inclusive board? What does a skills matrix look like? How can you set policies and so on, through what are good HR practices? How do you build an inclusive corporate culture? How do you design your programs and your marketing strategy and your outreach and your procurement to reinforce the values? And how do you engage with community? How do you leverage philanthropic dollars and government relations to build more inclusion?
So, in speaking of measuring progress, there's a movement in the nonprofit sector for regulation that's similar to the requirement on federally regulated corporations, for-profit corporations, to comply or explain related to diversity. To have that expanded to include similar requirements for nonprofit corporations and charities. What can you tell us about the regulatory requirement and your thoughts about including the nonprofit sector?
Honestly, I think the evidence is very strong that sectors that have been subject to employment equity requirements for the last 40 years almost have made more progress than other sectors. And why is that? Well, I think what gets measured gets done. And having, remember, with employment equity, there aren't quotas, there aren't targets. It just requires that you measure and you report the 4 designated groups at different levels in your organization, and you answer some basic questions about, do you have a strategy? Do you not? Do you collect this data? Do you not? If you don't, you must explain why not. And that simple requirement has had a profound impact on the levels of representation in, for example, financial institutions and communications. I actually find it strange that, for example, provincial organizations like hospitals and universities have no such requirements. I find it strange, frankly, that the nonprofit sector, and especially charities, which do benefit from taxpayers' largesse because of the exemptions and so on, don't have a certain level of accountability, given what we see is in place for federally regulated organizations. And I know Senator Ratna Amidvar has been a very strong proponent of this, dating back to when we worked on the Bill C-25, which extended the reporting requirements for federally regulated organizations. But I'm a big proponent, and I do think that at the end of the day, there's some real advantages to having this information. I mean, partly from a purely opportunistic perspective, we're seeing more and more funders, not just government funders, but big foundations, want this information before they write a check. They want to know what sort of commitments there are, what sort of numbers there are. Future Skills Center, which gives a lot of money out to nonprofit organizations for training programs, evaluation, and so on. It's baked right into the application processes. We're seeing more and more evidence that this is becoming important, as I said, not just to government funders, but to philanthropists and large corporations as well. So I think it's an opportunity, frankly, for nonprofits to get ahead of the curve and start collecting the data, start putting in place the processes, start developing their strategies. And we're really excited to be working with you, Mary, on some of the tools and techniques to help do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to talk about that. I mean, we are really honored to be working with the Diversity Institute to help nonprofits on their EDI journey and to develop e-learning courses to begin that process. Can you give us a little bit of information about some of the courses that we're developing and what it will specifically offer? Because the nice thing about it is I'm really excited to develop these courses that are specifically for the nonprofit sector, which is very distinct and unique within Canada. And I think given the circumstances that nonprofits do have different kinds of challenges that for-profit companies don't address. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the e-learning courses.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about the e-learning courses. And of course, these may change and they may be supplemented with things like webinars and podcasts, but we're looking at offering an introduction to EDI for nonprofits, which will help with just level setting in terms of basic terminology, the business case, why it's important, and so on. Creating an inclusive organization for nonprofit leaders. Here, I'm really excited because, again, it's an opportunity to get beyond consciousness raising to actually helping organizations develop strategies by looking at governance, human resources, values and culture, measurement, their entire business processes, and engagement and outreach. We are digging in on the issue of unconscious bias, privilege, and how to become an ally, because this allows individuals, regardless of where they are in the organization, to take action. And then the fourth course that we have planned is a very deep dive specifically into issues around diversity and philanthropy and fundraising, because it's very clear that the landscape is changing. And as the population is changing, so are the opportunities and the strategies around fundraising. We're also hoping that Charity Village will take advantage of some of the tools that are being developed through the 50/30 challenge, including, self-assessment tools and, our micropedia and various other things. So we hope that working together, we'll be able to provide some real concrete new material, and also to curate work from the best and the brightest, because there are a lot of really interesting courses from organizations right across the country that will provide a deep dive into very specific issues like truth and reconciliation, or how to create an environment inclusive for trans people, for example, which is becoming an important issue in many organizations.
Well, there's no question, and Charity Village is excited to partner with you and support you in developing further these resources that are sort of practical solutions related to the 50/30 challenge in the future. And I know that you have some things that you're planning in development. Could you give us any insight on any of that?
Well, again, we're one of the partners on the 50/30 ecosystem um, program, and the other partners include EGAL, um, the Women's Economic Council of Canada, uh, the UN, I want to call it UN Prime, the United Nations um, uh, Alliance, which is focused on large corporations, and CCAN, which is the Canadian Institutes and Colleges of Canada. We're all working together on different sets of tools. KPMG put together a collection of best practices, which we'll be hosting at the Diversity Institute. I think it's on the website now. And then we have a number of other tools like our diversity assessment tool, which will actually allow you to walk through a set of questions and develop an end-to-end diversity and inclusion strategy complete with best practices. So there's a lot of effort to both develop custom tools and curate, as I said, work that others are doing in one place. So there'll be a one-stop shop for lots of EDI content and support.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be marvelous to have that rich depth of resources available, and we can help steer people in the nonprofit sector to find that. I'd love to give an opportunity for our audience to hear any tips or strategies for individuals who would like to become stronger allies or agents of change within their organizations. Do you have any special advice for them?
You know, I think we have to approach this issue with humility. I've been working on issues related to women in technology, as I said, for over 30 years. I learn every day new things that I did not understand previously. You know, the whole issue of gender identity and recognizing non-binary people, um, thinking about pronouns as a very important indicator of inclusion. Uh, Taking truth and reconciliation to truth and reconciliation, and what that actually means in a very real way, you know, why land acknowledgements are important, and how to talk about them. All of those things are things that I've learned really in the last couple of years, and I'm lucky because I work with young people who are very engaged and aware of many of these issues. So really approaching it from the perspective that even if you are seen as an expert in one domain, there's no question that you still have lots to learn. I think that's important. The second thing, frankly, is to really confront your own privilege and bias. And often people talk about privilege through the lens of skin color. And there's no question. The evidence is 100% clear. If you're Black, you're more likely to have been pulled over by police for no reason. You're more likely to have been followed around in Holt Renfrew, or even kicked out of a coffee shop because you were waiting. There's no question that race is a very significant issue. But there are other dimensions of privilege. You know, being able to express affection to your partner in public is something many of us completely take for granted. And yet, if you think about it, there are many couples and many people who have hidden their sexual orientation or their gender identity for decades, and not been able to engage in things that we would all take for granted. If you think about, well, issues related to disability, often we focus on physical disability and, you know, curb cuts and making sure buildings are accessible. We still have to do more of that without question. But increasingly, we're also starting to look at cognitive differences and what that means to be a person who really doesn't see things that other people see, but may see things that other people don't see. So I think, for example, of people I know on the autism spectrum, and dealing with certain dimensions of interpersonal communication are very, very challenging. At the same time, they have other assets that are often superpowers. The same thing is true with people who have ADHD, where it can be a real limitation in certain contexts, but in other contexts, there's a reason why we see so many successful entrepreneurs self-identify as having ADHD and other cognitive differences. So becoming more aware of how people are different from us, and the implications that has in how our expectations are shaped. I think that, for example, we often underestimate the impact of socioeconomic status in this country. We have a myth that everybody is equal. Well, there is a big difference between someone who grew up in a middle class white neighborhood with parents who both spoke English and went to university, and from the moment they were hatched, they were on a pathway to being a lawyer, versus someone who is the child of refugees who don't speak English and are living on the poverty line, between a kid who has to work 30 hours a week to help pay the family rent and a kid who has the luxury of volunteering in a soup kitchen. And I think very often we don't see how some of those things can really shape the people who present themselves to us. And if we start to think more about our biases and our privilege, and we start to think more about where people are coming from and how their lived experiences shape who they are and what they can do, I think it becomes very powerful. And it was, I was on one panel, I think I mentioned this to you before, Mary, where we were talking about skills of the future and what, the World Economic Forum and others are saying, it's resilience, it's innovation, it's creativity, it's adaptability. And I said to the woman who was head of an HR in a tech firm, how do you assess those things in an interview? Because we know interviews often assess interviewing skills and not much else. And she said, well, I look for someone who has lived in another country. I look for someone who has had to learn a new language, because those are really strong indications to me that they're prepared to take on challenges. They're prepared to tackle difficult things. They're going to be more resilient and so on. And I thought it was such an interesting perspective. And it's one I share, which is often people who have had to overcome hardship actually have much more to bring to the table than people who have been, lived in privilege and not had to work very hard to get what they got. And especially in your sector, that kind of lived experience, I would think, is invaluable. But sometimes, we look for people who are just like us because those are the people we're most comfortable with. And that's one of the things that we as individuals can break out of. And then the last thing is not being a bystander. There's a long history of the banality of evil, and we see it in everything from the Me Too movement to the experiences of racism in healthcare and in other institutions, where things have been going on for a very long time that are very bad, and people knew about it and did nothing. And for every case, every scandal, every lawsuit that we see related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, almost invariably there were people who knew what was going on. And so I think helping people be courageous and to really be allies in an appropriate way, and not to stand for the microaggressions and the inappropriate jokes and the especially in your sector, the sexual harassment, frankly, of young women in fundraising. We really all need to take this on as a project that we work together on.
Incredible words of advice there, and it's so good to hear that there's enlightened recruiters out there, and what an intelligent approach to assessing candidates. But I wonder if you could just give us a few moments to tell any final advice to leaders of nonprofit organizations? Anything that you'd like to share with them as last thoughts?
I think the most important thing is not to think about this as a bolt-on that you can kind of delegate to somebody in your HR department or that person who seems to be committed to diversity and inclusion. This is part of leadership. Understanding this is part of leadership. Being able to lead diverse people is fundamental to leadership, and baking equity, diversity, and inclusion into your organization's strategy is going to create opportunities for your organization you would not otherwise have.